governments who can help to find a solution to the ongoing threats to civilians fleeing displacement. The United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. We gather at a moment where Syrians continue to face the risk of mass atrocities within the country, where the fate of men and women detained remains unknown, and where 6.6 million Syrians are living as refugees and 6.7 million are internally displaced, unable to return to their homes. As an institution, the United States Holocaust Museum understands all too intimately the cost of indifference. We're committed to trying to do for communities today what was not done for Jews of Europe. We're deeply humbled and ashamed to 11 years into the crisis find ourselves at this moment. We feel this way because we have all collectively been bystanders to atrocities that have happened in real time. These crimes have unfolded before our eyes in vivid detail, and we cannot, as many tried to do during the Holocaust, suggest that we did not know. Nor can we say that we didn't have ample time to find innovative strategies to try to prevent and protect. There will be a lot to learn from this experience about the unintended consequences of both action and inaction by the international community. But this is not an academic discussion today, not at a moment where we see ongoing risks of atrocities and threats that prevent the safe return of those displaced, especially at a moment where the world seems to have turned away and believe that the crisis is ending and talks of normalization are invoked. Today, civilians continue to be the intentional targets of mass atrocity crimes perpetrated primarily by their own government, enabled by Russia and Iran. And this includes ongoing detention and threats of detention, a key deterrent that we and so many others have reported on as being one of the main reasons why many Syrians cannot return home. Today is sobering for the millions of displaced Syrians who have been watching the events unfold in Ukraine. The crimes are all too familiar. We saw Syrian forces enabled by Russia perfect the besieging of communities, the targeting of hospitals, and the persistent and ruthless destruction of a nation with impunity. There was no real sanctioning of Russia for their actions in Syria, no cost inflicted on them for the crimes committed in Syria. The swift response to Ukraine is merited, but so too is it critically needed for the people of Syria who continue to suffer with no end in sight. The inequity in response is hard to comprehend, hence the urgency of this gathering today is glaring. We've seen what happens when perpetrators are intent on committing atrocities, when their actions go unchecked by the international community. Today, Syria and Ukraine's fates are intertwined. We must bring an end to these crises, and you who are speaking today have a critical role to play in making that happen. For those who are watching, please note that this event is being broadcasted live in 2 languages, Arabic and English, on both Facebook and YouTube. With that, it's my deep honor to introduce the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Ethan Goldrich, from the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of State.
Thank you, Naomi. Good morning, everyone in the Western Hemisphere, and good afternoon to those of you in the Eastern Hemisphere. I'd like to thank the Syrian Network for Human Rights for co-hosting this event on the subject of forced displacement during the Syrian conflict. SNHR is one of the leading organizations doing the important work of documenting the wide array of abuses and violations committed in Syria. This reporting is integral to bringing international attention to the plight of Syrians, promoting accountability for perpetrators of abuses, and placing pressure on all parties, especially the Assad regime, to cease violations of international humanitarian law and abuses of human rights. This past Tuesday marked 11 years since the Syrian people courageously and peacefully took to the streets to demand freedom, political reform, an end to government corruption, and above all, government respects human rights. The Assad regime met those demands with innumerable atrocities, some of which rise to the level of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The regime and its Russian and Iranian supporters must halt their ruthless attack on Syrians. The actions of the regime and its enablers have led to the displacement of millions of Syrians. Airstrikes by the regime and the Russian forces have repeatedly struck sites where civilians live and work, including hospitals, schools, and settlements for internally displaced persons, many of which were included in UN deconfliction lists. We are today seeing similar tactics and practices by Russia in Ukraine, which has already led to over 1.5 million individuals to be displaced to other countries. We condemn such tactics in Syria, and we condemn them in Ukraine. We are today, in its reply, the UN Commission of Inquiry has detailed reconciliation agreements which require individuals to undergo a reconciliation process with the regime as a condition to remain in their homes, have effectively induced displacements. NGOs have reported that these forcible displacements are part of the regime's strategy to strip people of their property rights, punish perceived political opponents, and enrich the regime and its allies. The United States condemns this and the reported looting, pillaging, and destruction of property by regime forces and armed groups. Reports of extortion, abduction, and torture as means to force residents to flee their homes highlight how forced displacements are part of a broader web of abuses and violations that impact millions of Syrians. The Biden administration has made it a priority to promote accountability and justice for the crimes committed against all Syrians. Perpetrators of these abuses must be held accountable. We will continue to use our sanctions authorities, including the Caesar Act, to press for accountability for Bashar al-Assad's regime and other perpetrators. In the past year, we sanctioned Syrian officials in the intelligence and security apparatus in connection with human rights abuses, as well as the armed opposition group Ahrar al-Sharqiya for human rights abuses in northern Syria. We also sanctioned Saraya al-Arin, the regime-affiliated militia that participated in offensive operations which contributed to the mass displacement of Syrian civilians. We strongly believe that stability in Syria can only be achieved through a political process that represents the will of all Syrians. As such, we continue to actively engage with our partners and to support efforts to advance the political process in Geneva and to ensure that a durable political solution remains within reach. Let me also make clear that the United States will normalize relations with the Assad regime, lift sanctions on Syria, or change our position opposing reconstruction in Syria until there is irreversible progress for the political solution. I look forward to hearing from our speakers today and to continuing to work closely with Syrians, Syrian-led organizations, and with all of you to address these important issues. I'd like to turn over to our Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, Russ Schiebel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation today. It's appreciate the opportunity to speak with you on behalf of PRM. This week marks 11 years since the Syrian people peacefully rose up to demand their rights be respected. And every day since then, Syrians have committed heroic acts to safeguard their neighbors and communities against the brutality of the Assad regime. The need for humanitarian assistance is greater than ever before, with more than half of the population unable to feed their families. 1/3 are internally displaced, most displaced more than once. Only half of the water and sanitation facilities across Syria are functional, and only half of healthcare facilities across the country are even partially functioning. More than 6.6 million Syrians have sought refuge outside of Syria, the largest forced displacement crisis since World War II. And in Lebanon, 9 out of 10 Syrian refugee households are living in extreme poverty. In Jordan, 83% of refugees rely on the World Food Program aid to meet their basic needs. And in Turkey, more than 70% of women refugees saw their household income decline during the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are signs of hope, and the United States remains unequivocally committed to supporting both the Syrian people and the countries that are hosting displaced Syrians. In Turkey, we fund organizations to provide Syrian women with resources and support to start their own businesses, not only increasing their self-sufficiency, but also creating jobs for refugees and host country residents alike. In Lebanon, the US government funds a program that provides cash assistance to more than 80,000 children from Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian households. This helps vulnerable families put food on the table, pay rent, access medical care, and buy clothes for their children. Since conflict broke out in Syria in 2011, the US government has provided more than $14 billion in assistance to Syrians in need inside of Syria and across the region. And I am proud that the United States remains the world's leading humanitarian donor. The Biden administration has also made it a priority to provide protection and assistance to those forcibly displaced. As part of these efforts, the president recently raised the US refugee resettlement target for 2022 to 125,000 people. This directive to restore and expand the US refugee admissions program demonstrates that we are truly putting America's values at the center of our foreign policy. Thus far this fiscal year, the US resettled 1,632 Syrians. We expect the arrival numbers to increase throughout the rest of this year and in coming years. But resettlement is not a comprehensive solution. Less than 1% of refugees benefit from third country resettlement each year. Therefore, humanitarian assistance will remain a key component in our efforts to improve lives in the region. I know that partner governments around the world are also providing critical assistance to vulnerable people, some of them on this call today, and I thank them and I encourage them to maintain those commitments or expand them as they can. We also understand the tremendous pressure regional governments are facing to cope with the challenges that come with hosting huge populations of refugees. While voluntary, well-informed return with safety and dignity is the optimal solution in any refugee crisis, such returns are simply not an option in Syria now. Small numbers of refugees may choose to return voluntarily, but the evidence is clear. Conditions in Syria are not conducive to large-scale refugee returns. We urge states to uphold their respective international obligations and to respect the principle of non-refoulement. Thank you very much, and I'll stick around for questions later as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those remarks. I think it's so critically to underscore what you just noted, that conditions right now are not conducive to returns, the importance of advancing justice and ending impunity, and also, in addition to increasing the refugee resettlement numbers within the United States, a recognition that that's not a solution to the problem, and we need to endeavor to do that. It is my deep honor right now to introduce the Ambassador and French Special Envoy for Syria, Brigitte Curmi.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you all. I need to apologize on behalf of Ambassador Curmi. As she had explained earlier, she had to leave earlier, so I will deliver her statement on her behalf. And first, we would like to thank warmly Fadel Abdul Ghany and the Syrian Network for Human Rights for bringing us together today to discuss the pressing issue of displaced Syrians, a cross-cutting topic with long-term implications for the country and for the region as a whole. So France welcomes this opportunity to shed light on whatever adjustments we can apply to our approaches to help advance the right to return, the human rights of refugees and IDPs, and to enhance accountability for those guilty of crimes, including forced displacement. The current situation in Ukraine, where we witness mass displacement, gives ever more urgency to this conversation. As we have reached the 11th anniversary of the Syrian revolution, this issue of forcibly displaced people is a major one. While the regime's brutal response to the revolution forced nearly 7 million people to flee the country and 6.7 million people to be internally displaced, the regime exploited these departures with the aim of preventing them from returning to their homelands and houses. In this regard, Damascus adopted several housing and land decrees and laws in 2012, 2018, organizing a legal framework for expropriation of population that are seen as a threat by Damascus. On another note, the regime has been putting high pressure on the displaced people in the areas out of its control by preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid to them. While just only 2 cross-line operations took place from the regime areas towards the northwest, it is obvious that humanitarian aid barely reaches the northeast. The international community, the UN and NGOs should remain highly mobilized by advocating for those displaced persons' protection and for the respect of their fundamental human rights. It is important to keep this issue high on the agenda and to make sure any progress towards a political solution duly includes the future of these 6.7 million people. As a major donor to the Syrian crisis, we allocate a large part of our yearly funding to the humanitarian crisis in Syria to the issue of internally displaced people, including through projects implemented in Idlib. Our contribution to the cross-border mechanism also aims at helping displaced people as the situation is worsening day by day in the Northwest. In addition to their other basic rights, the safeguard of housing, land and property rights is a core one. We must join forces to ensure those displaced people will be able to regain their properties and lands, despite the demographic engineering initiatives taken by the regime and other actors. We keep condemning the violations by the Syrian regimes of the rights of forcibly displaced people in the multilateral fora, be it at the Human Rights Council or at the UN General Assembly. There are reports of massive violations by the regime of the core human rights of IDPs and refugees returning to Syria or to their home areas. The recent findings of the Commission of Inquiry are clear. The Syrian Arab Republic does not yet offer a safe and stable environment for the sustainable and dignified return of refugees or for the 6.7 million people displaced inside the country. We call on the regime to protect the human rights of returning refugees and internally displaced persons, first and foremost their security, but also their land and property rights. This issue is at the core of the political process, as mentioned before. Without an efficient solution to this issue, it will be impossible to build trust in Syria in the future. It is also essential that those responsible for forced displacement are held accountable. Indeed, to forcibly displace a population is a violation of international humanitarian law. We reiterate our support to the mechanisms put in place to advance accountability, the Commission of Inquiry, the international impartial and independent mechanism, which plays a crucial role to bring perpetrators to court, either international courts or national ones. France would like also to underline the courage and the crucial role played by Syrian and international NGOs in collecting evidence and testimonies. This evidence will be crucial to ensure that the crimes committed will not go unpunished and that victims and their families will eventually see justice. The rights of displaced people to return to their area of origin or choice is fundamental, and Security Council 2254 resolution underscores the need to create the conditions for the safe, voluntary and dignified returns of refugees and IDPs. As we have had the chance to underline it several times, those conditions are not only of an economic infrastructural nature. Those include the protection thresholds put forward by the HCR. They are by nature political conditions, protection from violence, respect of property law, access of relevant UN agencies to monitor reforms. We have no interest or desire to hinder the return of refugees. On the contrary, we are fully aware of the challenges to host countries who have behaved so generously. But let's be clear, the Syrian regime as it is, focused on its security and military apparatus, cannot provide those conditions. A political process based on UNSCR 2254, where power sharing is real, where the aspirations of the Syrian population are finally reflected in the political sphere, is the only roadmap in sight to allow genuine change to take place and encourage massive voluntary returns. Experiences in the region show that prolonged displacement is the seed for further unrest and suffering. This makes implementing UNSCR 2254 all the more urgent. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, and thank you to Ambassador Curmi. In particular, just want to highlight two of the points that were made. One, which is so critical, that is threats to civilians today in Syria take so many different forms. Crimes are being committed in a number of different ways, not just in detention centers, but also the threats that are being faced in the Northwest and Idlib and elsewhere. Perpetrators are often creative in the way in which they commit their crimes, and strategies need to be created to tailor the response to target those unique threats. But also, as you so critically underscored, the Assad regime is intentionally creating the conditions that make it impossible for return, including through demographic engineering, using laws to prevent people from being able to return to their homes. So thank you for highlighting and underscoring so many critical points there. It is my deep honor right now to introduce Ambassador Robert Rohde, the ambassador for the negotiations on Syria and the head of the Division for Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Anti-ISIS strategy for the German Federal Office.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you very much to all of you, Excellencies, distinguished friends and panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I would like, first of all, to join my voice to thank the Syrian Network for Human Rights for setting up this very timely and important event. Unfortunately, over the past couple of years, we have come together at many events of like this to call for a safe and secure return, for accountability, for justice in Syria. And never since World War II have so many people been displaced. For Syria alone, half of the pre-war population has been displaced, as previous speakers have already underlined. Today, Germany hosts more than 800,000 Syrian refugees on its soil. And with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, war and forced displacement has returned to Europe. And even so, the world is now looking on Ukraine. We must not forget that Syria remains the #1 country of origin of displaced people in the world. During the past 11 years of conflict, the people of Syria have paid the highest price. History has taught us there can be no lasting peace without justice. It is an important signal that Syria remains high on our respective political agendas. As the conflict in Syria enters its 12th year, Syrian refugees can still not return home due to fear of violence, arbitrary arrests, torture, or persecution. For us, it remains clear. All return must be voluntary, safe, and in dignity. And far from being a Western concept or politicization of the topic, these are the core principles established by the UN. That is why it is so important that the international community continues to support Syrian displaced persons, be it in Syria itself, as well as in host countries, above all Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. The upcoming 6th Brussels conference in May will give us, the international community, the opportunity to once again reaffirm our support for the Syrian people. My government will continue its efforts as one of the biggest donors. Military aggression should never pay off. UN Security Council Resolution 2254 remains our collective handrail in order to get a political solution. And we remain committed to this in supporting UN Patterson's efforts to advance the political process by reconvening the Constitutional Committee or by his step-for-step approach. However, we should not be naive. Reciprocity and confidence are key. It always takes two to tango. And in this regard, we remain extremely concerned about premature normalization tendencies. It is clearly not the time to rehabilitate Assad without anything in return. And the EU27 have reaffirmed their unified stance on this in January. And we believe that efforts for peace in Syria must go hand in hand with accountability. This is a priority topic for our government. Let me be clear. Accountability is non-negotiable, cannot be part of a transactional trade-off. Damascus, as previous speakers have underlined, continues to be responsible for serious violations of international law and of international humanitarian law. The civilian population remains subject to indiscriminate, widespread, and systematic attacks that may even amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The 49th session of the Human Rights Council, currently underway in Geneva, we will continue to draw attention to the dire human rights situation in Syria and calling for strong language in respective resolutions. We must also ensure continuous support for the Commission of Inquiry and the IIIM, as they are vital for our efforts for accountability and human rights protection. Their existence is also legitimized by the success of the Koblenz trial, for which both provided important information. As long as the path to International Criminal Court is blocked, universal jurisdiction provides the only effective way to pursue crimes committed in Syria. One important example, I would say milestone, is the conviction of a former member of the Syrian intelligence by the higher court in Koblenz in January. We encourage other countries to apply universal jurisdiction or to create the necessary legal foundations. We are happy to share experiences and will continue to do so. Further, the issue of detainees and missing persons is crucial. That is why we support the request of the UN Secretary General for a feasibility study on an independent mechanism in the General Assembly resolution. We are looking forward to the upcoming report, which will hopefully provide us with not only concrete, but actionable proposals. Certainly, this won't be an easy exercise and it will take a very long time, but we believe that this is important to do whatever we can. We owe it to the almost 100,050 missing Syrians and their loved ones. There are a myriad of issues to be solved. We are still at the beginning, but the countless initiatives of NGOs like the Syrian Network, the Syrian civil society, and the international community, as well as the resilience of the Syrian people, bear hope. Let's continue to work together to ensure that no crime goes unpunished, that perpetrators are held accountable, that no victim is left behind. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you so much. And thank you for the remarkable leadership that Germany has shown both in admitting Syrian refugees and, as you noted, the recent Koblenz case of crimes against humanity by the Assad regime. Those offer both inspiring, hopeful avenues for future safety and also justice. But as you said, we can't leave anyone behind. So the endeavor ahead remains significant, and thank you for outlining what your government is doing. It is my deep honor right now to introduce Batoul Hdaifeh. She's going to be speaking as a survivor of Bayda Massacre. She herself has been forcibly displaced, one of the many courageous Syrians who are coming forward, willing to share their stories, but all too tragically, 11 years into the crisis, it is really, I think, for us, quite a moment of sobering reflection that you need to share your stories with us. I'm sorry that unfortunately the world has not listened enough and acted swiftly enough in response. Thank you, Batoul.
أولاً أشكركم على هذه الدعوة يعني الجيدة لأشارك معكم تجربتي. ربما أنا لا أستطيع أن أعطي إحصائيات كما تفضلتم، وأشكر الجهود المبذولة، لكن أنقل أحداث عايشتها وبعض المشاعر ربما التي حملتها معي. لذلك اسمحوا لي أن أبدأ بتهويدة علمتني إياها أمي عندما أنجبت طفلي الأول، بعد أن عدت من مدينة دمشق التي كنت أسكن فيها إلى مسقط رأسي ومدينة بانياس لأنجب طفلي الأول هناك. وكانت تقول التهويدة: يا باح يا باح يا ورق التفاح، اجى العصفور يتوضى كسر ابريق الفضه، هاي حاشيته وهي باسيته وهي واسيته وهي قالت له بلدي بلد السلام. عندما كنت حاملا تم اعتقال 3 من اخوتي، وطبعا 7 من اخوتي تعرضوا للاعتقال على فترات مختلفه. كانت تأتي تهديدات باعتقالي وأنا حامل لألد أمام أخوتي كنوع من الضغط، لذلك كنت دائمة الحذر والاختباء. بعد ولادة ابني بعدة أشهر وفي الثاني من أيار عام 2013 تعرضت مدينة بانياس وقرية البيضة إلى مجزرة مروعة راح ضحيتها نحن نقول أكثر من 800 شهيد، لكن الإحصائيات لم تستطع توثيق أكثر من 456 بسبب أن النظام حاول إنحاء هويات الضحايا أو الجثث بحرقها وتشويهها والتمثيل بها. تم استخدام الكثير من أدوات القتل والإبادة، لذلك كان الصراع الذي عشناه في تلك المرحلة بأي طريقة سأموت وما هي الوسيلة التي سأقتل بها ومن سيموت أولا، أنا أم طفلي أم زوجي أم أبي. بعض الضحايا قتلوا بالقصف بالمدفعية وبعضهم بالرصاص الحي، البعض ذبحا بالسكاكين، وتم استخدام الدهس بالحجارة أيضا وتكسير الأضلاع. وكل هذه الوسائل استشهد على أثرها أقرباء لي وأصدقاء لي من مدينتي. حفاظاً على أرواحنا دفعنا مبالغ مالية عالية لمن يستطيع أن يساعدنا في العبور عبر الحواجز بأقل الخسائر الممكنة وأقل فرص التعذيب والوقوف على الحواجز لمدة طويلة. واستقرينا أو وصلنا إلى منطقة في سوريا اسمها أورم. في تلك المنطقة في ذلك الوقت لم يكن هناك أي تواجد للنظام السوري، لكن كان القصف مستمرا بالطائرات. وأنا ومن ذهب معي من مدينة بانياس والبيضة وبعض الناجين القلائل أيضا، تحول الصراع من أي طريقة سأقتل فيها إلى أي طريقة أسهل للموت. هل كان من الأفضل أن نموت في بيوتنا مذبوحين أم نموت جراء القصف ونحن نازحين، أم لنذهب ونغرق في البحر في رحلة اللجوء؟ كان صراعا صعبا بالتأكيد. انتقلت أو اخترت الذهاب إلى أنطاكيا في تركيا، لكن زوجي بقي لمساعدة النازحين في الداخل السوري. وهناك عشت أنا وطفلي مع 3 عوائل أخرى في بيت صغير بوسائل الحياة البدائية. ووصلنا هناك خبر استشهاد أخوتي تحت التعذيب بشير ورشاد وعلى فترات مختلفة. بعدها انتقلت في عام 2014 إلى إسطنبول. وفي إسطنبول وصلنا خبر غريب أن هناك من يعيش في بيتنا في دمشق، بيتي أنا وزوجي. رغم أننا نملك الآن الأوراق الثبوتية، أوراق الملكية الرسمية وهي معنا إلى الآن، لكن علمنا فيما بعد أنه تم بيع البيت بأوراق مزورة من قبل محامين تابعين للنظام السوري. منذ عدة أشهر وصلنا خبر أيضا مشابه، بيتنا الذي كنا نملكه في مدينة بانياس أيضا تم بيعه بنفس الطريقة ومن قبل محامين تابعين للنظام السوري يقومون بتسهيل بيع أو تزوير الأوراق الملكية لبيع بيوت المهجرين. أيضا حاولت أن أكمل دراستي هنا، دراسة الماجستير، وأنا لا أملك من أوراق الجامعة سوى وثيقة التخرج الأساسية. حاولت أن أستعين ببعض الأشخاص في سوريا لإحضار أو لمساعدتي في إحضار بعض الأوراق من جامعة دمشق، وقيل لهم آنذاك إذا هذا الشخص أوراقه تحتاج إلى موافقة أمنية. تخيلوا حتى أنا في بلاد اللجوء لا أستطيع أن أكمل دراستي، بل ربما أصعب من ذلك أن من تبقى من أقاربي في سوريا لا أستطيع الحديث معهم، هم مهددين لمجرد أن يتحدثوا معي وأنا في تركيا، لا أستطيع حتى التحدث معهم. طبعا هذه القصة تشبه قصص آلاف من السوريين عاشوا نفس مراحل التشريد أو التهجير، وكلهم يرغبون بالعودة إلى سوريا، العودة إلى أوطاننا وإلى بيوتنا وإلى أماكننا، لكن بوجود نظام يقتل ويشرد ويعتقل ويعذب ويحرمنا من أبسط الحقوق الأساسية بل ويسرق ممتلكاتنا، فهذا الأمر صعب جدا. أريد أن أختم بأنني أنجبت طفلا جديدا منذ 3 سنوات، وفي ذكرى نجاتي من المجزرة في 3 من أيار 2019، لكني حاولت أن أعيد بنفس التهويدة التي كانت تغنيها لنا أمي عن بلدنا بلد السلام. لم أستطع أن أكذب لأن بلدنا بوجود النظام الأسد لم يعد بلد السلام، فصارت، وسأختم بها: يا باح يا باح يا حاملين السلاح، إجا البلد يتحرر، هيك قالوا، بتذكر هاي قصفيته، هاي دمرته، وهاي ذبحته، هاي قالت له ضب غراضك وانزاح. شكرا لكم.
Batoul, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and for ending in such a powerful and poignant way. It's often so hard for the public and policymakers to comprehend when we talk about 7 million refugees, almost 7 million, almost 12 million just displaced in general. But your story is an example that behind every single one of those people, there is an experience, unfortunately, of extreme loss, of enduring mass atrocity crimes, of having to flee, but also, as you so clearly articulated, a very intentional effort today by the regime to prevent returns, to take what is rightfully yours, to continue to deny your and others' human rights. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. I hope that serves as a call to action for all of us. I'd like to now turn to Jonathan Hargreaves, the UK Special Representative for Syria. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, and apologies for joining late due to some technical issues, but it was fortunate to join in time for that extremely powerful and moving testimony which we have just heard, for which many thanks. And it's very humbling to speak after such a testimony. And as you say, the only response to that really can be to commit to redoubling our collective efforts as the international community and in friendship with Syrians everywhere to increase everything that we can do, both to make life better for people who are displaced and to make life better for those who do return voluntarily and in dignity when that happens. And of course, it's particularly on the world's minds at the moment as we see more horrifying pictures of people being displaced from their homes from Ukraine. And I feel that this is, and I hope that this is, again, reigniting our consciences and the world's passion for doing everything that we can to look after displaced people in and from Syria. So, of course, in response to the points that you raised as the kind of framing points for this conversation, the first thing that we are able to do in terms of assisting displaced people and vulnerable people in particular is the amount of is the humanitarian support that we are able to give in Syria for internally displaced people. We have seen some very moving pictures, particularly over this winter, which have reminded us of the appalling conditions which so many people continue to live in. and the need for us to continue our work in supporting them to live in dignity in the face of prolonged displacement, which of course for so many people has been going on for so long. And in particular, those residing in camps, moving frequently. I think in the northwest Syria in particular, we must pay attention to the quality of camps and making sure that that infrastructure is sufficient and allows people to live in dignity. And as we approach this summer and the need for the renewal of the cross-border resolution for UN facilitated work into northwest Syria, we are committing once again, of course, to do everything in our power to make sure that the UN can continue to lead that work of cross-border support into northwest Syria, where so many internally displaced people are living. And with our colleagues in the Security Council and in Turkey, we will continue to do everything we can to make sure that that resolution is passed, and that we can continue to work cross-border as well as cross-line in as much as that is possible into the future. But of course, as well as emergency support and basic assistance, durable solutions are absolutely required. That is partly of course, an issue of finding durable political solutions. But the UK continues to believe that we need to do more and better work in terms of the kind of longer term, more durable support, which enables people to have their own livelihoods, to make their own investments, to feel as safe as possible where they are. So we will also continue, in addition to the support to emergency assistance, continue to try to work out ways with our international donor friends to make sure that we continue to put even more effort into making early recovery efforts all over the country as good and as effective as they possibly can be. And of course, we will continue to make sure that we continue to support refugees in the countries that are so generously hosting them. At the same time, we also need to absolutely make sure that confiscation of property cannot be used as a weaponization of the law. And of course, we need to do everything we can to pressurize and call on the regime to repeal problematic laws that act as obstacles to return. And we need to make sure that funds that we provide to programs aimed at rebuilding or rehabilitating structures in areas repossessed by the regime don't contribute to the abuse of property rights of residents and IDPs and refugees. And the funds don't go to entities or actors responsible for human rights violations. And in particular, we need to make sure that any advocacy and program response targets and thinks about the particular needs of women. And I think that together we can do more to make sure that we think about advocacy and programs for in support of IDPs and refugees, which take into consideration legal challenges that women face, and also, of course, the incredible role that so many women play in finding solutions for these situations. Of course, we also need to make sure that those who have been responsible for crimes and human rights abuses are brought to justice. This is a long game, and we have seen some really positive signs of progress. I'm sure that my colleague Robert from Germany will have mentioned, of course, the very important cases in Germany this year. We were very pleased last week in the UK to sign a memorandum of understanding with the IIIM, and we think that this will help us to share information between the UK law enforcement agencies and IIIM on crimes which we hope can be brought to justice. And this will be both a practical and symbolic gesture and signal of the progress which we are making slowly but surely in making sure that there is real accountability for the crimes which have been committed in Syria. Finally, of course, the truth is that the sustainable way for the issues facing IDPs and refugees to be resolved is for a political solution. And we all are frustrated and know that this is an incredibly difficult political process, and that in the meantime, conditions in Syria do not allow for safe, voluntary and dignified returns in Syria. We must make sure that underpinning any political progress or any transactional discussions on political progress, we have basic things in place that will help us to monitor the conditions for and the treatment of returnees. So we must have access for UNHCR and other agencies who are able to independently report on the suitability of conditions and also the experience of returnees when they do return. And fundamentally, we'll need to continue to support Security Council Resolution 2254 and continue everything we can to reach a political solution. We will continue to do that with vigour and determination, and in the meantime, we will do everything we can to support those who face such challenges in displacement at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, and again for just stressing the need to redouble efforts at this particular point. It's surreal that we're still engaged in a political battle to try to ensure cross-border support, and also really for underscoring that the longer that the crimes continue, the longer that detention is used to control, the more time the government has to disenfranchise the Syrian people, appropriate property, and create the conditions that make return impossible. Right now, it's my honor to turn the floor to Nadia Hardman, the researcher and refugee in the Refugee and Migrants Division at Human Rights Watch. Nadia, you have an incredibly frustrating job. I'm sure it must be very challenging to see Europe open its borders, the outpouring of support, including financial support to Ukrainians. Rightfully, there should be that level of attention. But what can be done to help Syrians today who are similarly in need? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Naomi, and thank you, Fadel and the Syrian Network for Human Rights for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak with you all in such an esteemed panel. It's a really good question you just posed, and I wrote actually a little commentary which I can drop in the chat. I was just in Denmark last week and commenting on the difference between the response of the Danes to the Syrian refugee crisis and the Ukrainian refugee crisis. It was just really quite sad and depressing. But I'll send you that commentary. I mean, we at Human Rights Watch, as you all know, we're fact finders. Our job is to investigate and document, and we will continue to do that when it comes to the Syrian crisis. And on my side, it focuses on Syrian refugees. And I, up until Christmas, lived in Lebanon, and the last 3 years have spent my time dedicated to the Syrian refugee response, both for a humanitarian agency and then with Human Rights Watch. And we are increasingly concerned at the rhetoric and narrative in the region that continues to mount, talking of returns, talking of the normalization and a time for people to go back. We've also just recently documented summary deportations of Syrians from Turkey. And I'll be spending a lot of time this year looking at conditions of protection inside Turkey, because we predict that the climate there is also changing. And these summary deportations are taking place kind of behind closed doors and on quite a regular basis, as we understand. I guess I will briefly give an overview of the report that I researched and published, which probably some of you already know about, Our Lives of Like Death, Syrian refugee returns from Lebanon and Jordan, where I interviewed 65 people that returned to Syria from Lebanon and Jordan from 2017 and 2021, with the majority returning in 2019 and 2020. And I would say between a third to half of those people experienced grave human rights violations and cases of persecution, and nearly everyone struggled to survive. Out of 65 people, we documented 17 cases of enforced disappearance, 21 cases of arbitrary arrest and detention, 13 cases of torture, cases of extrajudicial killings, kidnappings, and widespread extortion and bribery. And as I said, if people didn't face a human rights violation, they could not survive in a country where, there's mass inflation, struggling to access electricity, services, fear of crossing checkpoints to get to a hospital. Really, that is now part of our call as well, that, there is not just a risk of persecution on return. People should not be forced to go back when the country is difficult to sustain a dignified life. We looked at the reasons why people are returning, and as has already been mentioned, not that many people want to go back. And really, that needs to be emphasized, that, safety and security is still the main reason why Syrians do not want to go back to Syria. But our major finding is that people relied on misinformation or unavailability of information of the reality on the ground. Everyone we spoke to went back to government-controlled areas. We decided not to parcel out our report to say this is what happens if you go back to Homs, this is what happens if you go back to Damascus, because that's playing into the playbook of trying to parcel out parts of Syria to declare they're safe. And so we really wanted to move away from that. The cases of abuse are similar to the cases that have been documented for years in Syria. The brutality of the torture inside the detention centers, the case of enforced disappearance, denial of the state, with a deep centralized control by Damascus. We often found that people ended up in Damascus detention centers, whether they were picked up in Dara or in Homs. That was really important to highlight. Everyone we spoke to also did their due diligence. They got security clearances. They entered into reconciliation agreements. And despite this does not protect people on return, and that really needs to be emphasized, particularly in country of origin information that I've seen that has said that this may be an indicator to protect people on return. I have examples of a family in Lebanon that went on the general security organized return. Everyone was approved, the 34-year-old man included, and he was picked up on the second day that he returned to Homs and brutally tortured for 4 months and passed around various intelligence agencies before his mother sold her land to bribe the judge, everyone else to release him. As I said, we documented cases of extortion and bribery, checkpoints at small amounts of money to large sums of money paid to try to get information about loved ones. This was really quite astounding how much was extorted from people by senior officials. And as I said, our call also speaks to the humanitarian situation inside the country. Our recommendations are wide and long, and I'm sure you may have seen some of them already, to the Syrian government, to the Lebanese and Jordanian governments, and to all Syrian refugee host countries, not to force returns, of course. That's more relevant to the region, but also not to introduce legislation like in Denmark, which facilitates or declares areas of Syria safe and removes temporary protection. So we're doing a lot of advocacy in Denmark actually around that. And it really importantly to highlight to continue to fund host communities in the region. For there not to be a premature push to facilitate returns-based programming, that programming needs to be limited to things like protection counseling. Although how you do that in a situation where humanitarian agencies, and particularly UNHCR, does not have adequate access is difficult. We push for a monitoring mechanism, and we support other partners' calls to establish an independent monitoring mechanism. Of course, UNHCR has a massive role in that too, but recognition that it is really difficult to get meaningful access inside Syria, and that needs to be underlined at all points. And yeah, maybe I'll stop there because I know already we're over time.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for that incredibly comprehensive tour de force on what the realities on the ground are and what needs to be done, and just really the remarkable work that your organization is doing, Fadel, your organization, so many Syrian organizations are doing. I think if we want to be very honest, there is not a single person who's spoken today who does not know a Syrian who has returned and has been detained, or whose loved ones have been detained, or tragically have returned and been killed. That is the stark reality. So when we talk about particular areas being safe for returns, that is simply not the existence that is lived by the Syrian people. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Fadel to close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't want to take much from your time, so I'll be brief, and I'll share also my presentation via email. So because I think we exceed the time, so in just 2 minutes of comment, that what I want to say, very briefly, that we all know that 14 million that due to continuous and heavy atrocities and violation took place in Syria. Those are actually violation is still committed till this moment. So we are facing the generation, the root of the IDPs and the refugees is still going on actually. So those 14 millions going to be increased actually, not decrease. So we are talking about return. So we are talking about hundreds of thousands who's fighting to flee out of the hell or inside Syria. Actually, what we're gonna to talk about, as you referred, Naomi, we are just fighting about the cross border, which is actually shame that Russia blackmailing the aid of those who's being displaced due to Russia and the regime bombing. We wrote a legal document arguing that entering the impartial UN cross-border doesn't require the Security Council resolution because the regime refusal is arbitrary, and because the regime is also looting those aid. I would like to jump directly to the recommendation, which I think that the support of the forcibly displaced inside Syria, especially the women and children in the camps, that support must be increased due to, as I mentioned, generating of more IDPs fleeing from the regime control area. Actually, working on the admission of the UN and ignoring the arbitrary Russian veto, that's something the state must also act. Finally, I think that the effort of achieving a political transition toward democracy, that's the only, and then those millions of displaced people and refugees be able to return in dignity, freedom to their homes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fadel. And again, thank you to everyone who's joined this conversation. Thank you to the governments who have asserted their recommitment to try to find a solution to not just the humanitarian crisis, but to the ongoing commission of mass atrocity crimes, to the deep political crisis, to the reality that there are millions of Syrians who do not face a prospect of being able to return home in the near future, to the fact that there are still children who do not know where their parents are, and there are people who are scared every day on whether or not they will be able to survive tomorrow. This is a very live urgent situation. It merits the same level of attention, commitment as what is happening in the Ukraine. And the perpetrators, tragically, especially when we look at the actions of Russia, have known what they've been able to get away with for decades in Syria. The two fates of these countries and of people are intertwined. I really hope that today with this event, with the focus around the actions for the anniversary and also with the tragic events unfolding in Ukraine, we truly bring the level of political attention, will, and action that the Syrian people so desperately need. There are few heroes when it comes to the Syrian crisis. The true heroes are the Syrian people, people like Batoul, people like Fadel, and others who every day are fighting to try to preserve their communities' basic human rights and create a future Syria. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.